I mean, in the first century, the consumption of blood wasn't just frowned upon. Under Jewish law, it was an absolute taboo. It was considered fundamentally abhorrent.
Because the ancient understanding, which is rooted deeply in the book of Leviticus, was that blood contained the life force. It was the very soul of the creature, and that belonged exclusively to God.
Which means to consume it was unthinkable, a direct violation of the sacred order. So when a new teacher suddenly arrives in the ancient Near East using this incredibly visceral anatomical language about eating his flesh and drinking his blood, he is deliberately triggering the deepest cultural and religious alarms of his audience.
He absolutely is. He is forcing a crisis of understanding. What begins as a promise of spiritual sustenance in these texts very quickly transforms into an inescapable moral obligation.
Welcome to a special Sunday reflection for June 7, 2026. Today, we are opening up a stack of historical and scriptural sources surrounding the observance historically known as Corpus Christi, the solemnity of the most holy body and blood of Christ.
And our focus here is an intellectual and spiritual exploration of how these ancient scriptural mandates directly challenge our modern societal priorities. We are looking closely at the mechanics of divine nourishment.
Because the mission of our conversation today is to see how the concept of communion extends far beyond the quiet architecture of an altar. It spills directly into the streets, demanding a concrete response to the vulnerable neighbors standing right outside your door.
The physical reality of this faith forces you to confront systemic injustice, as well as the persistent human tendency to idolize wealth and self-sufficiency.
I actually want to look at how this specific commemoration entered the church calendar in the first place because it entirely challenges our assumptions about how religious institutions operate. It did not originate from a papal decree drafted in some gilded room by established theologians.
No, it didn't. In the year 1207, the initial spark came from a 15-year-old Belgian Augustinian nun named Juliana de Cornilon. She began experiencing this recurring vision of a radiant full moon that was marred by a single dark spot.
And interpreting that vision essentially became her life's work. The radiant moon represented the church's liturgical year, which was luminous and full of observances, but that dark spot was understood as a glaring omission.
Specifically, the absence of a feast dedicated to honoring the Eucharistic body. But she faced immense institutional resistance when she attempted to have this vision recognized by the authorities at the time.
Which makes perfect political sense for the era. The 13th century church was a highly structured, male-dominated hierarchy, deeply invested in scholastic theology. When a young, uncredentialed female mystic claims to have received a mandate from heaven that requires altering the universal liturgical calendar, it threatens their established monopoly on divine revelation.
Local clerics and prominent theologians entirely dismiss her. She was even forced out of her convent at one point due to the political turmoil her claims generated. It was a 50-year struggle of advocacy marked by intense theological scrutiny and localized power struggles.
It is profoundly telling that a central universal observance of the church was initiated not by a powerful cleric, but by an obscure teenage orphan. This reveals a distinct pattern where divine inspiration deliberately bypasses established centers of influence.
The mandate comes through the most vulnerable, marginalized voices in society. It forces the powerful to listen to the exact demographic they would normally ignore. And eventually, that persistence did reach the highest levels.
In 1264, Pope Urban IV, who had actually known Juliana earlier in his life before his papacy, finally instituted the feast universally. His decision was catalyzed by a reported Eucharistic miracle in Bolsena, Italy.
Right, where a consecrated host reportedly began to bleed onto the altar corporal. Following this event, he commissioned St. Thomas Aquinas, the preeminent intellect of the era, to compose the liturgy for this new observance.
Which resulted in the famous sequence known as the Laudasean. But before I go further into the theology of that, we should probably clarify those terms for listeners who might not be familiar with medieval liturgy. What exactly is a corporal, and what is the function of a sequence?
Well, a corporal is simply the square white linen cloth placed beneath the chalice and the bread during the liturgy. It's a highly practical, everyday fabric meant to catch crumbs. And a sequence is a liturgical hymn sung before the reading of the gospel.
So Aquinas is taking impossibly dense theology and translating it into poetic, accessible language. He writes the line, "Signs, not things, are all we see," which brilliantly grounds the high theology of transubstantiation in tangible reality.
He's showing how God elevates the humble and the ordinary. I mean, simple bread, common wine, a linen cloth, a young nun, these are all used to communicate eternal truths.
So we have this medieval history grounding the divine in the tangible. But tracing this concept back to the ancient scriptures reveals that this reliance on physical vulnerability is definitely not a medieval invention. Look at the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 8.
That chapter recounts the Israelites' 40-year journey. Moses explicitly reminds the people that they walked through what he calls a vast and terrible desert, a landscape of parched ground, scorpions, and intense deprivation.
The text does not shy away from the brutal biological reality of their environment. They had just escaped slavery in Egypt, where their basic physical needs were met, albeit at the horrific cost of their freedom. Now, in the desert, they are facing genuine starvation,
And the narrative focuses heavily on this affliction of hunger before introducing the provision of manna, which the text describes as a food unknown.
which served a dual purpose. It sustained their physical lives day by day, but Moses explicitly states it was given to teach them that humanity lives by every word that comes forth from the mouth of the Lord.
Taking a moment for quiet reflection on these ancient texts with tools like Claire and Horatio can really help ground us. In a noisy world that is obsessed with accumulation, having a brief, guided space to center your thoughts on these deeper realities is incredibly useful.
It is, especially when you consider the mechanics of how the manna actually operated, which I want to challenge a bit. The scriptures mention that the manna rotted and bred worms if the Israelites tried to save it for the next day. If I am a parent in a terrifying, desolate wasteland, my very first instinct is to save a portion of today's food to ensure my children don't starve tomorrow.
You want to secure their future.
Well, punishing them with rotting, maggot-infested food for simply trying to be responsible and prudent seems incredibly harsh. Why structure a divine gift with such a brutal, uncompromising limitation?
That is the crucial tension of the text. What you are describing as parental prudence is, in the context of the Exodus, a reversion to the economy of Egypt.
Because the Egyptian system was built entirely on massive accumulation, hoarding grain in storehouses.
Which created a power dynamic where the vulnerable were enslaved to those who controlled the surplus. The manna establishes what we can call an economy of grace, acting as a divine countermeasure. By forcing the manna to rot, God is placing a hard expiration date on capital.
It entirely dismantles the mechanics of generational wealth and accumulation. It functions almost like a disappearing message on a secure app. You cannot hoard the communication. You are forced to re-engage in the relationship anew every single day.
The manna forces an active daily reliance on divine providence, rather than allowing the Israelites to build a stockpile that would give them the illusion of self-sufficiency. The desert destroys the illusion that our own power and bank accounts can insulate us from vulnerability.
Because if you can store up enough resources, you no longer need to trust God, and you no longer need to rely on your neighbor. The rotting of the hoarded manna taught the Israelites a radical, non-negotiable lesson in communal solidarity.
Everyone gathered what they needed for the day, no more and no less. But as you look at the timeline, the manna was solving a temporary, physical problem in the desert.
Which raises the question of how that ancient anti-economy translates to the permanent spiritual claim Jesus makes centuries later in the gospel texts. The translation happens in the Gospel of John, chapter 6.
Jesus explicitly invokes the history of the manna to draw a sharp contrast. He declares himself the living bread that came down from heaven. He tells the crowd, "Your ancestors ate manna in the desert, but they died."
The manna was a biological stopgap. It merely prolonged physical life. The promise Jesus is offering is eternal life and an abiding presence, stating that whoever consumes this new bread remains in me and I in him.
And the reaction of the crowd is explosive. They quarreled among themselves and were profoundly scandalized when he instructed them to eat his flesh and drink his blood.
Modern audiences often sanitize this passage. We turn it into a neat metaphorical poem about absorbing Jesus' teachings. But to a first-century passerby, a leader telling his followers to literally eat his flesh sounds terrifyingly akin to a cult practice. Why did Jesus deliberately use such shocking, visceral language instead of offering a clean, philosophical metaphor?
To understand the shock, you have to look at the original Greek phrasing. As the dialogue in John chapter 6 progresses and the crowd's resistance grows, Jesus does not soften his language. He actually intensifies it.
He shifts from using the common Greek word for eating, phagen, to a much more graphic word, trogein.
Yes, which literally means to gnaw or crunch with the teeth. He is deliberately blocking any attempt by the audience to spiritualize or domesticate his command.
By anchoring his ultimate sacrifice to the most basic, inescapable human necessity, the biological act of chewing and swallowing food, He permanently destroys the barrier between the sacred and the mundane. Religion is no longer an intellectual exercise confined to a pristine temple.
Faith is not an escape from physical reality. It is a direct entry into the messy physical suffering of the world. By identifying himself as literal food and drink, Christ is saying the divine is found in flesh and blood.
Consequently, it is found in the very real, suffering bodies of humanity around us. The scandal of the gospel is that God is not found by ascending away from the dirt of the earth, but by descending into it.
And if the physical reality of the divine is meant to be consumed and shared in this gritty manner, it fundamentally alters the community that partakes in it.
Paul's first letter to the Corinthians captures the social consequence of this perfectly. He writes, "Because the loaf of bread is one, we, though many, are one body, for we all partake of the one loaf."
We have to synthesize this insight with the gospel mandate from Mark chapter 12, which commands us to love God and love our neighbor as ourselves.
The love commanded there relies on the Greek concept of agape. Unlike eros, which is romantic love, or philia, which is brotherly affection, agape is a selfless, unconditional choice that completely transcends mere emotional sentiment.
It demands concrete, often difficult action. In the context of the early church, agape was practically expressed through the defense and sustained care of the poor, the widow, and the orphan.
The early Christian communal meals were intimately tied to this specific care for the vulnerable. The ritual was the ethical mandate in physical form. What happens then to the integrity of that ritual when a modern believer participates in this communion but actively ignores the impoverished or scapegoats the marginalized?
It creates a profound structural contradiction. The theology of communion is inextricably linked to ethical responsibility. To claim participation in the Eucharist while practicing the idolatry of wealth we discussed earlier, or while ignoring systemic injustice, invalidates the action.
True communion is never a private spiritual retreat where one simply feels peaceful for an hour on a Sunday morning. It functions as a mobilization order. You are ingesting the responsibility to bear the burdens of the marginalized.
The moral challenge here is unavoidable. If believers truly constitute one body, as Paul insists, then ignoring the homeless, the imprisoned, or the oppressed is not just a lapse in charity.
It is akin to severing your own limbs. You are looking at your own arm and deciding to let it starve. Our modern culture often trades in a currency of cruelty, finding it much easier to isolate and blame the marginalized for broader societal problems.
But active solidarity is the only authentic response to sharing in what Paul calls the cup of blessing. To accept the cup while rejecting the impoverished neighbor is to fundamentally misunderstand what is being consumed.
Sharing in that one loaf means ingesting the responsibility for the whole body. When we look at the trajectory of all these texts, the divine presence is consistently located among the afflicted.
From the starving Israelites in the desert, to the visceral crucified flesh of Christ, and finally to the vulnerable neighbor today, the location of the divine does not change.
On a similar note, observing this through line reveals a singular, unyielding divine logic across the centuries. The journey begins with the manna in a vast and terrible desert, where an ancient people were forced to unlearn the hoarding of wealth.
It moves to the shocking scandal of the bread of life in the Gospel of John, where faith is anchored in gritty, physical reality rather than abstract philosophy.
And finally, it arrives at the formation of a unified, responsible body of believers in Corinthians. Spiritual nourishment is never meant to be securely stockpiled, just as the manna bred worms when stored away in jars.
The transformation required of the believer must be directed outward. Receiving the gift necessitates becoming the gift for others. The boundary between the altar and the street is completely dissolved by this imperative of active love.
As you step away from this reflection and carry these texts into your week, consider this challenging reality. If the ultimate expression of divine love was to make himself physically vulnerable and consumable for the sake of humanity, what parts of your own life, your wealth, or your comfort are you still withholding from the vulnerable neighbors who hunger right outside your door?